On the 28th of September 2007, American Airlines Flight 1400 took off from Lambert-St. International Airport on a routine passenger flight. But what happened next would be anything but routine. The flight crew found themselves facing an in-flight left engine fire, followed by a terrifying failure of the nose landing gear, hydraulics and electrics. Stay tuned to find out what happened in this incredible story. On the 28th of September 2007, American Airlines Flight 1400 was scheduled to depart from Lambert-St. International Airport for Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. The aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, was carrying 2 flight crew, 3 flight attendants, and 138 passengers. On the day of the incident, the flight crew reported for duty around 11:40 for the scheduled departure time of 12:40. The captain was the pilot flying, and the first officer was the pilot monitoring. For this flight, they had a very experienced crew. The captain was 59 years old. He had previously served as a pilot in the US Air Force for 20 years, and over his time as a pilot had accumulated 14,000 flying hours. Of those hours, 6,000 were as a pilot in command, and 831 were as a pilot in command in a similar aircraft to the one they were flying today. The first officer was 43 years old and had previously served as a pilot in the US Air Force, in the US National Guard, and in General Motors Corporation. Over that time, he'd accumulated 7,000 total flying hours, including 3,000 flying hours as a second in command on a similar type aircraft as the one he was flying today. During the initial attempt to start the engines, the left engine did not start, and the flight crew then notified American Airlines maintenance personnel of the problem. A mechanic then informed the captain that maintenance personnel were ready to manually start the engine if it was unable to be started automatically. The time was now 12:41, which was 1 minute after their scheduled departure time, and the crew performed their before start checklist and takeoff briefing, and then the maintenance personnel instructed the captain to initiate the manual engine start sequence. This was done by holding down the engine start switch to the start position, whilst the maintenance personnel manually held open the left engine's air turbine starter valve. So this valve becomes quite important during this incident. So just to give you a basic understanding of jet engines, so they work off 4 main principles, which is suck, squeeze, bang and blow. And the way in which that works in the real world is air will be sucked in through the air intake at the front of the engine. It will then be compressed or squeezed and then mixed with fuel and ignited, which gives you the combustion. And then those expanded gases lead to the blow part, which is the gases coming out of the exhaust of the engine and also turning the internal turbine. This turbine is then connected to the inlet fan, the large one at the front of the engine, and it causes it to turn, then sucking in more air. And then the cycle starts again. So once the engine is up and running, it is almost self-sufficient. It just needs that supply of fuel to keep it going. So when it comes to starting the engine, obviously it doesn't have that yet, so they use starter motors and starter valves to get this done. One interesting point about turbofan jet engines, if you don't know, is that it's actually the large fan that generates most of the thrust. So there's a bypass ratio that they have on these engines, which means a lot of the air that fan sucks in will go round the core of the engine and actually be used as thrust at the rear of the engine. And those expanded gases that come out of the exhaust of the engine actually only produce less than 50% of the engine's thrust. So for this instance, this aircraft had 2 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines that used air turbine starters to start. This system had an air turbine starter valve, and once electric power was supplied, the valve would open and allow high pressure air to turn the air turbine starter turbine, providing rotational power to the engine core and getting it started. It's worth noting at this point that during a normal start, this air is about 30 psi with a temperature of around 300 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. But if the valve was to be left opened while the engines were at a high power setting, for example during takeoff, then that psi would get to about 80 or 90 and a temperature of about 560 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit. So during the first attempt at a manual start on the left engine, the captain informed the mechanic that he saw no indication that the left engine's starter valve had been opened. This attempt was unsuccessful, and about 13:01 during the second attempt, the engine started. At the time, there was only one approved manual engine start procedure, and this used a specialised wrench to hold the valve open. It would take about 20 to 40 minutes to complete, as the specialised wrench was not part of the standard toolkit and would then have to be found and used, and further latches and doors would have to be opened. The maintenance personnel decided to use a prying device to reach and depress and hold down the manual override button, but doing so, they actually bent the pin within the system, which kept that valve now stuck open. From this point, the crew then got the aircraft ready for departure, they taxied, and then were cleared to take off from runway 30 left.
American 1400, St. Louis Tower, runway 30 left, turn right heading 345, clear to takeoff of the transponder.
Alrighty, the transponder's on, up, and make it to the left, right turn to 345, clear takeoff 30 left, American 1400.
The takeoff roll and takeoff were uneventful, with the crew bringing the landing gear up, and at 1,000 feet, the first officer reported to air traffic control that the airplane was now passing through an altitude of about 1,500 feet. It was just after this point that the first officer stated that the left engine, ATSV open, light had illuminated. This quickly led to the engine fire warning bell, and then the first officer stating that the left engine fire warning light had illuminated. The captain then asked the first officer to contact Lambert-St. International Airport and declare an emergency. The first officer then got on the radio and stated the following.
Yeah, we're gonna have to declare an emergency, swing back around there and land back at St. Louis.
American 1400, Roger. Just maintain, you need at or below 5,000 beside. You need to, do some work first, I'll come right back.
No, we're gonna come right back around and we've got left engine fire indication.
At this point, the first officer then began performing the engine fire, damage and separation checklist, and he started completing the first two parts of that. The first one being disconnecting the autothrottles, and then placing the left engine throttle to idle. The captain was still flying the aircraft, and he was turning it back towards the airport. Air traffic control came back and stated that runway 24 was ready if they needed it. The crew agreed that this could work, and then they were given the range and distance by air traffic control.
American 1400, Roger. The airport said 3 o'clock and 6 miles, maintain 2,500.
We're going up to 2,500. We do have the field inside 1,400.
At this point, the captain stated that he needed to brief the flight attendants on what they were going to do next. He then handed control of the aircraft to the first officer, and then briefed the flight attendants, stating that they've had a fire caption for the left engine, and they're going to return to the airport and be on the ground in roughly 10 minutes' time. He further stated that he didn't expect an evacuation, but he would give her the signal if they needed to evacuate. The captain then resumed control of the aircraft, and at 13:16 the first officer stated that the left engine fire warning light was still illuminated, and then he resumed conducting the engine fire damage separation checklist. With the situation now seemingly under control, the crew had completed the checklist and were on their way back to the airport. The aircraft started to experience further issues. This started with the captain losing his primary flight and navigation display panels. Soon after, the left engine fire warning bell then sounded again, followed by the first officer stating that the warning light was still illuminated. 14 seconds later, the alarm was sounded again, and then again 4 seconds after that. The pressure was really starting to increase on this crew. The first officer then stated, "Just got power transfer too." He was referring to the condition in which loads normally powered by the left side of the electrical system start to be powered by the right side, which can explain why the captain lost his primary and navigation displays. With the captain focusing on flying the aircraft, the first officer was still trying to get through the emergency checklist for the engine fire. The pressure was really building on this crew. The aircraft was telling them that the engine was on fire, and they needed to do something about it before the issue got so great that it was unrecoverable and the aircraft would collide with the ground. The first officer then stated, "I can't even shut it off," and he was referring to the fuel lever that needed to be switched to the off position. This action needed to be completed before the fire handles could be pulled. Struggling with the lever for the next few seconds, the first officer managed to switch it into the off position. From this point, he then grabbed at the fire handle and pulled it, which subsequently fired the first fire bottle. This aircraft is equipped with a fire extinguishing system that includes 2 fire extinguishing agent containers or bottles per engine. So when the fire handle is pulled, it distinguishes one of these bottles, and you have one more just in case the fire is still going. The first officer then lets the captain know that both bottles have been extinguished, and then the crew start talking about gear and flaps and what speeds they need to set for their approach and landing. At this point, the cockpit door becomes unlatched and starts swinging openly in the cockpit. The first officer then states, "We've lost all power," and the captain asks the first officer to try and sort the door. The first officer tries several times to close the door, lock the door shut, latch it on things, but to no avail. After a few moments, they then decide to continue flying the aircraft and dealing with the emergencies that they have. The captain then calls for the landing gear to be lowered, and the first officer pulls the handle down. The crew are then cleared by air traffic control to land on runway 30 right.
American 1400, St. Louis Tower, runway 30 right, clear to land. Winds 310 and 13.
Clear to land, 30 right, American 500. 1400.
Due to the electrical issues they were having, the landing gear position lights were not illuminated. So the crew were unable to determine whether the gear was down or not. They had the feeling of the drag on the aircraft and the loss of airspeed, but they couldn't determine if all the gear was down. At this point, the captain was desperate to get some electrical power back and tried to start the auxiliary power unit, or APU. The APU is a small generator that produces its own electrical power, so if the generators on the engine stop working or there's an electrical issue, then the APU can be used to power the aircraft. Unfortunately, in this situation, when the captain tried to start the APU, it didn't start. With the radio still working, the captain then decided to request that air traffic control visually inspect the landing gear of the aircraft and determine if all 3 landing gears were down.
Tower, American 1400. Do you see any indication we have our wheels down?
American 1400, the mains appear to be down, but I don't, there's no nose gear. I don't believe there's a nose gear.
Alright, we're gonna have to go around then.
The captain then initiated a go-around. Now this was quite unusual, as the aircraft was potentially still suffering with a fire. The aircraft was not indicating that there was still a fire, but due to the electrical issues that they were having, the crew couldn't be sure 100%. The captain had to weigh up the risks. He knew for a fact that his nose wheel landing gear had not deployed, so he was going to land with the nose wheel landing gear up. Both him, the airport, and his crew were not prepared for that landing, so in that moment he decided that a go-around was the best option to give everyone enough time to prepare for this type of landing. During the go-around, and due to the amount of issues that this aircraft was now experiencing, the captain requested that an off-duty company pilot who was sat with the passengers be requested to come forward to the cockpit to assist. Whilst the off-duty American Airlines captain was getting ready to come forward to the cockpit, the crew discussed the potential of dumping fuel to make the aircraft lighter, and also inform air traffic control that they're going to need some time to get the nose wheel landing gear down.
Yeah, we're gonna figure out what the heck, trying to get this nose gear down here.
It was at this point that air traffic control reported to American Airlines 1400 that they had seen a fair amount of damage caused by fire on the number 1 engine.
American 1400, Roger. Just for your information, there was quite a bit of black, I guess soot or whatever on that left engine, so the fire was real.
This indicated to the crew that the fire was real, and although it appeared that the fire was not still burning, the crew needed to get this aircraft down as soon as possible. Due to the aircraft only having 1 working engine, and still being extremely heavy, they were struggling to climb the aircraft in this go-around.
American 1400, go ahead and make a right turn headed 060 and climb and maintain 3000.
Alright, right, 060, and it's gonna be extremely slow climb here.
The crew now discussed the best course of action. The captain was still struggling to fly this aircraft, with only 1 working engine, most of the landing gear still down, and a very draggy and weighty configuration. He was struggling to turn the aircraft as this would reduce some of the airspeed he had, and had to make slow, long turns to position the aircraft. The crew decided that the emergency gear extension would have to be carried out, which allowed the landing gear to be dropped through gravity alone, but they were still not sure if this would get the nose wheel landing gear down. They then decided to change the runway from 30 right to 30 left, as this was 2,000 feet longer and gave them more time to land. The first officer then began performing the emergency gear extension checklist. Whilst doing so, the off-duty company pilot stated, "You've lost all hydraulic pressure on the right side." And the first officer was just shocked. How did this happen? He continued with the gear extension, and although there was no internal indications, the crew heard a noise similar to the sound of the nose gear being extended. The first officer then spoke with air traffic control and requested that they visually inspected the landing gear once again.
Got a main nose gear down for American 1400 now.
American 1400, it looks like all three gears are down. There's a possibility that the gear doors on the mains are still hanging. We can't tell from here.
Yeah, they probably are due to electronic sequencing, so those will drag at them. That isn't really going to matter, but to make sure we got all the wheels down.
Yes, sir. We think three appear to be down and in place.
The captain then stated to the crew, "We've got no left engine, we've got no right hydraulic pressure on the right side, we don't have any hydraulics on the left side." The aircraft was in a pretty bad way, but the crew were confident that they could continue with this approach and hopefully get this aircraft down on the ground. The off-duty company pilot then used the public address, the PA system, to brief the passengers on the situation.
Well, ladies and gentlemen from the flight deck, obviously we have a problem with the aircraft. We are returning to airport for landing. Please pay attention to the flight status completely. You probably will have aircraft as we roll on the runway. At this point, don't be alarmed by that, but flight attendants, information right now. Please everyone be in your seats with your seatbelts fastened.
American 1400 were then cleared to land by air traffic control.
American 1400, you're cleared to land runway 30 left.
Good, thanks. Clear to land 30 left, American 1400.
During the final stages of the approach, the off-duty pilot spoke to the flight attendants and informed them that they're not planning to do a ground evacuation, but to be prepared for one. The crew were struggling to get the flaps and the speed under control due to the electrical and hydraulic issues the aircraft was having. Because the aircraft believed that the gear was not down, they then started to get the too low terrain warning on the way down. At 13:32, the aircraft successfully touched down on the runway. With the crew not wanting to utilise the reverse thrust with one engine not working, they then relied on the brakes, which mercifully worked even with the hydraulic issues they were having. The aircraft then came to a halt and was approached by fire trucks and safety equipment to check on the aircraft and ensure that any fire had been extinguished. The off-duty pilot then makes a PA to the passengers, informing them to stay seated.
Ladies and gentlemen, you will see fire equipment moving towards the aircraft and checking the aircraft out. That is a precautionary. We have a left engine fire indication that they are checking that out now, so right now we have no indications that it was an actual fire. We did shut that engine down. Please stay seated.
The fire crews check over the aircraft and eventually use foam to extinguish any flames that are left in engine number 1. After this is completed, all the passengers are deplaned on the runway without any further incident. So as we discussed earlier in the video, when the maintenance personnel manually started engine number 1, they bent the pin within the air turbine starter valve, which caused it to remain open. It was this issue that started the fire in engine number 1 and led to the other issues surrounding the hydraulics and the electrics. It was found that the fire caused 3 leaks in the hydraulic hoses, which caused the hydraulic fluid to leak out. After the aircraft was stripped down, it was discovered that the air turbine starter valve air filter had not been cleaned or checked before this incident. The filter had been so heavily damaged that the end cap had become free and allowed the airflow to be blocked. It's this issue that led to the engines not automatically starting. Because the end cap was blocking the airflow to the starter, it meant that there was no airflow to allow the aircraft engine to start. It was this reoccurring issue that kept leading to manual starts of these engines and the incorrect way of manually starting these engines, which then eventually led to this bent pin and this engine fire, which could have been avoided. It was also noted that the pilot's interruption of the emergency engine fire, damage and separation checklist at the critical point, prolonged the fire and led to additional problems, including the loss of hydraulic pressure, which in turn caused the nose landing gear to fail to extend. That being said, the crew were dealing with a multitude of issues and incidents and emergencies, and an aircraft that was struggling to fly normally. And even with all these issues, managed to land this aircraft safely with no injuries. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you enjoy these air crash investigations, check out this playlist here. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you in the next one.